Hey there guys, sorry to interrupt the episode, but I just wanted to tell you that I got my real estate license in the state of Rhode Island. So if you need to buy, sell, or need help renting a property in the state of Rhode Island, feel free to reach out. Contact me at maxwellwillett@kw.com or call me at 401-487-4477 and I'd be more than happy to help you. Thanks guys and enjoy the rest of the episode.
Knowledge is Power is where you come to hear people's life experiences to learn from. So, without further ado, let's roll the intro.
Stay hungry, stay foolish.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other thing, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
I have a dream. Will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character.
Hello and welcome back to the Knowledge is Power podcast. This is your host, Max Willett, and I got another great guest on today. So if you could go ahead and introduce yourself, that would be great.
Sure. I'm Christine West. I'm an architect, and I'm a principal at KITE Architects.
Very cool. Yeah, so I've always been, not always, but throughout high school, I was kind of fascinated with architecture. I took drafting in high school. I went to down here in the sticks in Cheraho. And we had a engineering, drafting, and design class. And I remember the first house I designed was like open floor plan. We used a program called Revit.
Of course.
Yeah.
You used to be pretty young.
Yeah.
Revit wasn't invented until I was out of college.
Yeah, I'm 21. And that's like the only program we use for architecture, but I'm amazed at what architects are able to accomplish. But that's enough about my history with architecture. So let's hear your life story and how you got up to this point of your life.
Okay, life story in 30 seconds. Go.
It can be as long as you want it to be.
Sounds good. Well, I grew up in upstate New York, Corning, New York specifically. It is an interesting town. It's the headquarters of Corning Incorporated, which has historically been an innovator. They've invented fiber optics, Gorilla Glass on your phone, unnamed, amount of invention. So a lot of smart people in that town. And my father got a job as the director of the library system there. So we moved there when I was 4. My mom started out as an industrial designer at Syracuse University. That's where they met, at Syracuse. But she eventually became both a kitchen designer and a landscape painter. She was very proud of painting. She was very accomplished. So I had a really great kind of grounding in appreciation for both the arts, literature, but also in a town full of wicked smart people, as they say in Rhode Island. So as I went through school, I was pretty good at school. I liked math. I liked science. I also liked reading a lot. Kind of had my pick of what direction I wanted to pursue. Given that it was pretty much a high-tech town, everybody's parents, it seemed, were working in the research and development lab, inventing all those things. And so I sort of thought that scientist was the obvious path. And I kind of held on to that even through junior year, even as I really was exploring art, thanks to my mother and the kind of exposure to painting and drawing lessons. I absolutely loved creating art, but I didn't really want to become a fine artist. So it didn't occur to me that architecture was the path to really combine that love of more technical nature and the kind of math and science approach that architecture embodies with the creative aspect, the visual thinking. And then what knit it together for me was a summer program at Carnegie Mellon University, where I ended up at undergraduate school, where I really saw that it was more than drafting. It was more than making stair details. It was really about creating spaces for people. And that was the hook that kind of got me into it. So yeah, I would love to say there was a mentor that pushed me. My art teacher, who I loved, actually told me, "Don't be an architect. It's terrible. It's just, you'll hate it." And
yeah.
It's like, okay, I guess I'll be an architect.
Yeah, fascinating. It's good to hear that. So you come from an artist background, sort of, and it's funny. I just interviewed somebody who works for Industrial Light and Magic yesterday.
Oh wow!
For the podcast, which was really cool.
Yeah.
And he never really knew that he wanted to be a VFX artist. And he sort of comes at it from like a technical sort of viewpoint of the art, because it really is. It's an art.
Yeah.
And then to hear you sort of come at architecture from the artist standpoint and then apply it to architecture is really interesting, and I want to get into that. So I guess one of my first questions for you, well, why don't you sort of explain KITE Architects?
Thanks. Yeah.
We'll do that first, and sort of the business and what you guys specialize in, if you specialize in anything.
Yeah, sounds great. So our firm is actually going to be celebrating its 50th anniversary next year. So
Congratulations.
Thanks. Yeah. I was not a member of the firm. That would have put me in kindergarten.
Yeah.
But it was founded in 1974 by Bill KITE, very accomplished and talented architect, and his wife, Lynna KITE. They ran the firm for many, many years. I came to Providence in about 2003 to join the firm, and my current partner, Albert Garcia, also had joined the firm the year earlier. So as Bill and Lynna were having their sights on the horizon to retire, they asked Albert and I to join as owners. And when they eventually retired in 2013, Albert and I became the two sole owners. So we've got about 11 people and a really nice portfolio of work. And Albert and I have really spent a lot of time being intentional about the kind of clients and projects we take on. We love a challenge. We really don't see the technical and design and aesthetic sides and the craft of architecture as being separate. For us, that meaning is really rooted in the technicality and an excellent level of craft, but it also has to have meaning, and it has to be supportive of us as humans. And I have a lot to say about human-centered design and such.
Okay.
But most of our work, we've got a nice balance between things like educational environments for universities, private schools, and such. We're doing more work with corporations in terms of a post-COVID workplace. What does that even look like? We work with a lot of nonprofits who are trying to figure out affordable housing and how to provide job opportunities to people who may not have had opportunities. And then finally, we do a smattering of occasionally custom residential for very special clients.
Okay. Oh, so you guys specialize on, I guess, really more the industrial side.
I'd call it commercial and organizational.
Okay.
Institutional is kind of a catch-all that would include a university as well as a nonprofit.
Are there any structures in Rhode Island that you can point out that you designed?
Wow, yeah, where do I start? Well, we just finished the Stonewall House on Brown University's campus. It's on Benevolent Street. It is the country's largest freestanding center for students who identify as LGBTQ or questioning as community. So we crafted that out of combining a historic house that was built in 1820 or thereabouts and creating an addition that provided accessibility, kind of gutting a lot of the interior to make some meeting spaces and community activity zones. So that was a real point of pride. One of the other projects that we're continue to work with Crossroads, Rhode Island, when they moved across the 95 from downtown onto Broad Street, something that everybody passes through if they're driving through Providence. So we did an interior renovation of the lower floors back in the early 2000s, and we're actually working with them now on some really significant projects to help them achieve the goal of ending homelessness in Rhode Island. So that's up and coming.
Yeah, that's definitely a big issue that's going on right now, especially with everything that was going on at the State House not too long ago. I'm not sure if that's still going on, but
it's always going on.
Yeah.
We haven't fixed it yet. And then some of the other examples that people might know, the Dean Hotel was a point of pride. I think that really kind of changed a lot of people's image of downtown Providence and really catalyzed a lot of the creative spirit of Providence. We just wrapped up the Bodhi Spa up on Broadway in Providence. Really great people. It's kind of a water journey kind of environment, which was terrific. And, a lot of things along the way. So,
cool. Yeah. So I think we should get a little technical in the process. So I'm really curious to hear. All right. So I am somebody that works at Brown University and say, hey, I need this building to be upgraded, to be more modern. How does that process start? And can you walk us through that whole process of working with a customer?
Yeah. Great question. So I think a lot of people, if you ask them what architects do, sometimes they'll say design buildings, sure, of course. Some will say, well, they make blueprints. It's like, okay, well, they're digital.
Yeah.
But what I like to say in response to that is that's like saying what a doctor does is write prescriptions. And if you think about that, of course, they're writing prescriptions, but that's at the end of a long process that starts by asking the patient a lot of questions, by looking, listening, thumping on your chest, taking tests, analyzing, thinking, consulting research, coming up with a variety of different ideas on what could be causing this, and then what the course of treatment should be. At the end of the day, writing a prescription for something may be one of those tools that it helps that patient. Could be physical therapy, could be change in diet, could be a combining factor. And architecture is just as complex. So we act like that physician in asking questions at the start. So say you come to me. We generally will lead a team of not only architects, but engineers, like mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, plumbing. We start by just assessing and analyzing what you've got. So that's measuring the building, but also looking at the systems. And then we kind of take our special kind of look at it and saying, what are the opportunities? And to understand what the opportunities are, we have to understand where you want to go with the building. So let's take the example of the Dean Hotel, right? They wanted to create an affordable but very creative place that reflected the spirit of Providence, but was affordable enough so that it wasn't a barrier of entry for the price. Because a lot of artists and creatives and people generally, can't afford $500 a night for a hotel. Like the goal was to make a room that was $150 a night and below. Puts tremendous pressure on the cost, because you can spend your way to great design, certainly. So what we did with that project specifically, listening to that goals and thinking, okay, well, how does that then drive our approach to, say, the rooms? How are we going to make the guest room something that's a great experience but not spend a fortune dealing with it? How are we going to open up the ground floor and create spaces that you can rent to a coffee shop and a restaurant and a karaoke bar and help support the hotel's finances so that they can continue to keep their room rates low? So we look at all those opportunities. And if you think about kind of a spiral, some people compare design thinking to a circle. But if you can envision a spiral that starts with the discovery phase, what I've been talking about in terms of looking at what have you got to work with. Sometimes it's just an empty field, but a field comes with roads and neighbors and utilities. Next starts to be the analysis part, where we start to say, well, what are the patterns? What are the needs that are inherent in what you're trying to do? How do they match up with what the site or the building can offer? And then the next step in that cycle is to propose. And you say, okay, well, I propose, empty out the ground floor. We're going to knock down these walls. We're going to place all the windows. We're going to put solar panels on the roof. Then you test, and that iterative part is what the secret sauce to all design professions is, where you don't just stop at that one circle. You say, well, is that really going to work? Is the shape of the roof and the orientation of the roof right for solar panels? Can we remove that wall, or is it in fact structural? And then you start it all over. You figure out what you don't know. You look for patterns, you look for opportunities, you propose something, and then you analyze. And you keep closing down on that spiral until you finally get to these design solutions and at the end of the day, a finished project. So that's kind of how I would describe the process.
Yeah, great. Can you explain the biggest difference between, like you said, you're starting off with a structure like the Dean Hotel, or when you're starting with something from the ground up?
Yeah.
So what's the biggest difference between those two processes?
There's, I think there's a little more flexibility in new construction to dictate the massing, let's call it, and the shape of the building. A lot of times, but not always, with an existing building, you have this kind of exterior face. But, at the end of the day, you're still looking at probably a very, very good overlap. There's always design constraints, whether they're internal from the client or financial or system-wise, or whether it's a constraint that's presented by what's there. So our process is very similar with both. I think just being in an established city like Providence, even with new construction, like our project for Summer Street that's going to hopefully get underway this spring, there are regulations like zoning that are going to dictate a lot of what that massing and appearance are going to be. I think for that project, we're really excited because we're exploring some ways to be very expressive with the outside in a way that fits in with the city, but is also very innovative. And so anybody curious to see what that looks like can check out our website at www.kitearchitects.com. So it's interesting. The existing buildings, I was never a preservation architect to begin with, but working in the Northeast, you pretty much have to become a preservation expert because there's so much opportunity and so many projects are reusing a building, whether it's just really old or historic or even, from the 50s or 60s.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned regulations. What is the most annoying regulation that you have had to design around or with that you've encountered in your career?
That's a great question. Boy, I mean, if a rule is that annoying, we tend to try to get around it.
Yeah.
And not have to follow it. I think generally, I mean, I'm on the side of regulation in a lot of cases. So full disclosure, I was chair of the Providence City Plan Commission for about 10 years, enforcing a lot of the planning and zoning regulations. I was a member of the State Building Board of architects, like reviewing, and I still am on the Providence Building Board, reviewing code exemptions.
Very
and such.
cool.
So I think that there's a rooting in safety.
Yeah, absolutely.
That the codes embody, which, if you're going to provide something else, make sure it's safe. And then in terms of the zoning and planning regulations, there's an element of consensus and community consensus. And there's a lot of fairly robust processes around community participation. Doesn't mean to say every project is popular. There's always a protest, but in theory, our rule of law kind of embodies that community consensus about what we should build. One of the most, I don't know.
So like when you first started and you weren't on the board, like what kept coming up that you were like, oh gosh. Anything come to mind?
Well, one of the interesting things is around, may sound really trivial, but stair design. And I understand why. There's safety aspects, and we want to have a very accommodating point of view in terms of things that are safe and easy for people to navigate, right? But in a private residence, being able to use like a ladder to get to a fun space or otherwise explore kind of different spaces with different dimensions. It's like, you can see different types of staircases in more historic architecture in Europe, and there's many different ways to kind of traverse a path, and so it's a little annoying to be constrained by that. There's a lot of rules that are slightly annoying in terms of it does kind of limit your creative options. On the other hand, I find that the constraints of finance are probably more constraining than anything.
Okay.
It's easy to dream up something that meets all the criteria. It's the funding it. So I've really made it a mission to understand where the money is coming from in any given project and have a deep understanding of how that's driving the decisions that the owner is making. And if you can understand their goals, then you can work with that to achieve something that's going to be great. And if you don't get that right, you have zero chance of getting anything built.
Absolutely. Yeah. What do you think is the most unique design that you've had to do in your career?
Most unique design
Yeah.
in a one-off. Well, we once did an outdoor TV viewing pavilion.
Okay.
This family had a great outdoor deck, and they absolutely loved watching hockey.
Yeah.
And they're like, well, we want a roof so we can watch hockey outside in the rain.
Huh.
Okay. It's your money.
Yeah.
We can do that.
Yeah.
I don't know if we'll do it again. But
I could understand that for like football.
Yeah.
But like around here when hockey season is going on, I don't know if I want to be outside all the time.
Yeah, it's like walls and heating systems are kind of nice.
Yes. Or football, like if you're outside, because it's like football's an outdoorsy thing, but
late
or
summer, September.
baseball or like something like that. That's interesting.
Yeah, very unique. I've done a lot of unique. I will say that in our practice, because we focus more on finding clients that we want to work with that are doing good things for the community. We kind of dabble in. It's always unique and it's always interesting. Any given moment, we'll have the water spa, but maybe we'll also have like a museum conservation lab, or maybe we'll have a restaurant. We're working on a training kitchen with the Genesis Center, who helps people find a career in the culinary arts. So it's that glimpse into everybody's own world that is absolutely fascinating.
Yeah. One of the most impressive, I think, feats of architecture around here is there's many. We live in a great area for that sort of stuff. And when I was a kid, my mom would bring me and my sister to the Pequot Museum.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
That place is incredible.
Yeah, it really is.
I don't know if you know the people that have designed it. I don't know who designed it, but...
Yeah, I can't recall. I'm sure we could look it up. But we actually went down there and we're looking at a solar system with them. It didn't end up panning out, but even many years ago, they were trying to figure out how to reduce their electric bills and power bills because it's a huge operating cost. Absolutely huge, right?
People complain about their houses. I couldn't imagine what the electricity bill is there.
Yeah. No, I mean, and so my whole graduate work was around trying to find ways to do innovations around sustainability in a cost-effective kind of way, and looking at it through the lens of process and practice. So anyway, with the museum, there were some really innovative solar collectors. I think one was a spiral and other kinds of things that combined different forms. One was a parabolic lens that would collect it. And we're thinking, well, how can we incorporate this in an artistic way into a sculpture? And I think that they have some really great outdoor exhibits and things. So it would have been pretty cool. But, I think now, many years later, we're at the point where solar is kind of a no-brainer. So that should be better for everybody to
Yeah, you definitely drive down the street and you see a lot of houses with solar now.
Oh, yeah.
The only thing is that the technology seems to be advancing so much.
Yeah.
So it's like, I feel like the solar companies need a way that they can easily be upgraded for not like a large amount of money.
Yeah.
Because solar panels in 5 years, you can already predict that they're going to be a lot more efficient than they are right now.
Yeah.
So I think that's the biggest holdback for a lot of people is that, is the technology going to be out of date in 5 years? Because if I live in my house for 30 years, sure, I'd have no problem changing it out every 5 years, but I don't want to drop the cash.
Yeah, exactly. The first cost.
Yeah,
It's a good point, being an early adopter. I can't even tell you what we paid for our first big screen TV. It was ridiculous. You can probably buy the same TV for about 1/10 of the price. So there's that risk. Well, there's a lease model, which is becoming very popular.
Yes.
I think they just rolled out in Rhode Island an idea for a program to essentially subsidize the leasing of solar panels. So the homeowner gets the benefit of the electricity.
Absolutely.
But the installation costs are covered by a subsidy. So I think that's kind of a game changer for a lot of people.
Something I wish that I think they would do more often is so they're taking down a lot of forest in southern Rhode Island to put in solar panels, which seems kind of contradictory to the point of solar panels, right? But then you got the old Bennies in Westerly, right? It's just sitting there abandoned. So there's a for lease sign there, but I doubt any why not put solar panels on top of the bennies, and use already developed spots that are abandoned for solar panels instead of taking down forest, I'm all for, efficient energy, greener energy. I think a lot of people are, but I think the way you go about doing it is, I think, the biggest point of conflict. I don't want to get political here, but
no, I know it's a huge point of contention, right? So, I look at solar energy as any other kind of crop, you know, and I think you've got to look at the carbon offsets of what that greenery is providing versus
that's a very interesting point.
Right. And also, if you look at a long view of history and look at the East Coast, and, this was a very different landscape when in 1492 or even when Roger Williams got here. And the indigenous people had a way of forest management that was very different than just an untamed forest. They managed it for sure. And then it was all clear cut, absolutely clear cut. These forests that we see here are not that old, and but geological terms.
Yeah.
So I guess I take the long view, meaning in 30 years, if that technology is obsolete and we're doing more offshore wind, you can take those down, the forest will come back. So I think there is an aesthetic component. I think people here value the rural lifestyle and the rural imagery, and driving by a solar farm is upsetting on that front. But honestly, I find, the kind of horrific damage that climate change is going to bring
Absolutely,
a little more
yeah.
upsetting. So
Yeah.
that's where I stand. on
Yeah,
it.
absolutely.
So to
Yeah.
your question specifically about bennies is that if you think about engineering and how advanced it is, Revit, right? Revit is a very sophisticated tool that we use now, and the model can actually tell you the engineering strength of every single piece of metal. You can imagine with cost control, once engineering got sophisticated to really predict loads in a mathematical kind of way, we went from oversizing giant mill beams that were just, tremendously strong, down to engineering things within an nth of their capacity. That especially held true in the 50s and 60s, and it went too far. We started to see roof collapsing from too much snow, or a windstorm would. So codes have ramped back up and made stronger winds that have more strength and tolerance in either direction. But buildings of that area specifically are incredibly weak. They wouldn't meet a current code for a new building, let alone the kind of tremendous weight. Because you think about those solar panels, there's solar panels, and now think about how snow drifts and builds up against it. So a roof that might have only collected about a foot of snow in a storm now is going to be covered in 4-foot drifts as they come against the panels. So the risk of collapse of that roof is why most flat roofs on existing buildings are a tough sell. However, if you raise that building, and it's a loss of a building, but that might be a better use because it's already, and turn it to permeable surface. I think, honestly, the potential for parking lots to have solar canopies is huge.
Yeah, I think they're doing that at URI.
Yeah,
aren't they?
yeah.
I was seeing that, and I'm like trying to figure out, like, they building a parking garage? I was like, but then I saw them put the panels there, and I was like, that makes a lot more sense.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's just such a benefit, too, because it helps shield from the rain and the snow and the heat in the summer. So, I don't know why every parking lot in the country isn't covered with solar panels.
That, I think, is brilliant. That, I honestly think, what can go wrong? Hopefully they don't, fall and hurt people, but
There's some wind uplift, but you'd go to Arizona, and it's pretty commonplace to go to the grocery store, and there's solar sunshades in every grocery store parking lot. So I think it's catching on, and I think that will be a good
that's a really
alternative.
interesting idea. I think that if there's a way to do it, I think that's probably one of, if not the most efficient way to do it. Are you seeing like more customers request, like if they're building a building from the ground up, to be able to add solar later down the line?
Absolutely. Yeah, either immediately or down the line. And I think we're past that tipping point where the economics really make sense. It is now incredibly lucrative, to the point where solar is a financial instrument, meaning that there are loans, tax credits, complicated ownership deals to not only take advantage of the incentives that are offered by the government, but more importantly to essentially arbitrage the value of that solar against rising electricity. So, for example, if you can lock in a contract to sell your power at 15 cents a kilowatt, and the alternative is energy rates rising to 25 cents, you're going to be the preferred market provider, and you can sell that electricity all day long. So it's fascinating to see, once Wall Street gets a hold of solar, what happens to it. But it is literally saving some of my clients hundreds of thousands of dollars, not only in first costs to go with solar, but essentially, this is true with our project with Crossroads, the big project to provide apartments that are permanently supportive. So somebody coming out of shelter can have a home. They're not abandoned. They're not on their own. They have a stable place to kind of regroup and thrive, really. So what's enabling that project is we're able to reduce the operating costs to the point where the mortgage on the building becomes affordable, which is a great win for the public investment, right? If taxpayer dollars are reduced because we can invest in solar energy and help reduce the burden on the taxpayers, it's kind of a win-win.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm actually curious to hear your opinion on this. So I mentioned before we started the podcast, I have a 3D printing company.
Sure.
And affordable housing is a very important task. I recently had on a professor from the University of Texas who is mainly a psychology professor. He did a lot of work down at the border in Texas with immigrants and things like that, and talking to them and helping them, people who needed, psychological help. And he was, talking about how there needs to be a way to help them get into affordable housings eventually. And I think 3D printing, the technology, not the little ones that you buy on Amazon, has serious potential because you can build a 500 square foot small house for like 20 grand with 2 people and a concrete pour, essentially. Have you had any experience with that?
You know, I've looked into it, you know, and I think I think in certain climates that does really well. I did see a pretty extensive documentary on a little village where it's also kind of important to understand that that's replicating really just the framework of it, right? So if you think about a southwestern house, you don't need too much more than a mud adobe kind of shelter. And you know, but our expectations for thermal comfort are different than, say, you know, when we were building, you know, indigenously, even in you know, people used to just bundle up and go to bed when it got dark and cold.
Yeah.
They used to just put up with the heat or seek the shade or like, take a nap during the hottest part of the day. We have expectations of perfect temperature inside all year round. We have expectations of electric light and refrigerators. We have expectations of soft surfaces like carpet and an ability to keep, you know, sofas without them getting moldy, you know. So we have layered, we have expectations on indoor plumbing. So if you look at the structure as a piece of a building, it's really only about 10 to 20%. So I coming at this from kind of a skeptical point of view, I think as labor shortages continue, that could definitely be a piece of it. I think new technologies are always interesting, but it's not the silver bullet because there's so many of those other trades that have to go into it. And I honestly think that the root of our affordable housing crisis isn't the construction technology. I think there's a lot of really great, bright people who are full of inventions on how this is going to be. But honestly, I'm getting pretty old now, and people have been talking about both modularization and 3D printing kind of as the savior. And it's just like, well, that wasn't the problem that we had. We have a lot of you know, forests that are managed responsibly, providing timber. We have a lot of carpenters. We have ability to put up a 150,000 square foot building, which is what we're proposing in a week. We have that technology. That's not the problem that is hardest. What hardest is the people part of the equation.
Yeah.
And that
seems to be a reoccurring.
It's a reoccurring theme, right? Right? So let's go back to zoning. You know, it's representing the consensus of the community. If the consensus of the community is they don't want any more buildings, you're not going to have any more buildings. And we're really paying the price for that local control. And I know that there's some proposals to really kind of force the issue and say, look, we've got to provide for each other. We can't just exist with zero population growth.
So have you converted any of the old like mill buildings around the state? Have you personally like done projects like that?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. We've done quite a few of them. And, you know, those are really adaptable buildings that, you know, they're basically just shoe boxes.
Yeah.
that you can make anything out of. You know, so in terms of, we just haven't even scratched the surface in terms of what we can redevelop, you know, let alone go to some of those advanced technologies. I was just listening to Richard Godfrey, who is running essentially a new certificate in real estate at Roger Williams University. But he was talking about really making a push to develop some of our commercial corridors that are existing. So think about Route 2, you know, in Cranston or any other strip mall kind of oriented center. Tons of parking lots. It's already on a transit network. But these single story low density buildings are kind of a waste of space. You know, these are not established residential neighborhoods. So why not permit zoning to build small scale with shops on the ground floor, so no loss of commercial space, and then apartments upstairs. The reality is that most communities in Rhode Island, with the exception of a couple places you can imagine, it's going to be Providence, Pawtucket, Newport, you know, prohibit anything like that. Mixed use is kind of a dirty word, and you're not really allowed to build apartments in most places except those cities. So I think there's got to be some fundamental change in how people think about density and allow this, because there's no shortage of people wanting to build. There's no shortage of incentives now that people have woken up to the depth of the problem. But I think there's some real reform around zoning and community acceptance that has to come our way before we're working out affordable housing.
I have a pretty interesting example. So I have family up in New Hampshire, and we were going to lunch, and he's my uncle's father-in-law, so married in family. Amazing guy. He's got a very great business, and he took me to lunch at this building that was a multi-use. It had businesses on the first floor and apartments above. And the building owner was giving incentives to people who were working or living upstairs to work in the businesses on the first floor and like rent, and like giving them discounts on the rent. So then that would then incentivize more businesses to come to that business.
That's awesome.
So, and I thought that was a really great idea, especially like to do it on college campuses.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. Reduce commuting costs and time and everything.
Yeah. So like, so give a discount on room and board if they work, and not like where they don't get paid any money. They get a certain discount off room and board, and then they get a paycheck too to work at these
Great
businesses.
deal.
incentives for businesses to move there and for students to want to live there.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So
Absolutely.
I think
for anybody, not just students.
Yeah, exactly. Like but just another example would, just to have them on college campuses. But something like that I think would be really cool.
Oh, definitely.
But so let's talk about, I want to get a little bit technical.
Okay.
Because I really like learning, and I don't really remember a whole lot from the architecture side of that class that I took, because I wanted to be a mechanical engineer.
Oh, yeah.
I went to URI for 2 semesters for mechanical engineering, and I enjoyed 3D printing a lot, which I guess if there's some type of engineering that it falls under, it's mechanical, because it's a very broad type of engineering. So can you explain the different types of roof pitches?
Sure. Different types of roof pitches,
Yes.
meaning their symbolism or how you
actually
clad them.
So I'm going to sound, my inexperience in architecture is really going to come out through here. But like there's there's when there's 12 involved and
okay.
you know what I mean?
Right, yeah. Okay. So,
okay.
This might be helpful for the people watching online, so you think about, the horizontal distance, your x-axis, as being the 12.
Yeah.
And then if you say, okay, I have a roof that's 6 over 12, that means you're going to go up 6 for every 12 inches.
Okay.
So, and then once you get that 12 and then 6, he's like, aha, I'm just going up that slope. I'm just going to continue it.
Okay.
And it's easy for carpenters to calculate that because they make special carpenter squares that have those kind of built in.
Well, it's just slope. Like
right,
if you
it's
look
just
at
the slope.
on a graph. Okay.
Yeah, and you can easily measure it out. If you've got 30 feet from your edge of your roof to the center, it's like, okay, and I want it to be 6 to 12. It looks like I'm going 15 feet up. It's math you can do in your head.
Yeah.
Just about anybody can do in your head. So and it's a really just convenient way to talk about that. And it's a convention that's just stuck. So I actually kind of love the question because, when we talk about residential architecture and even commercial architecture, there's cultural attachments to different roof pitches. You see a form and you're like, that's a... So, if you think about a super steep roof that's over 12 to 12, let's call it 16 to 12, like an A-frame or something, that starts to be kind of very Swiss Village, or a ski hut, deep snow where you don't want any snow accumulating on it. So as soon as you do that super steep roof, it's just like, that looks kind of Swiss.
Yeah.
Like, is this the right place to put a little Swiss Village? Like, I don't know. I find it that you really should be matching up the appropriateness if you're going to use that kind of symbolism. So then you go down the scale and 12-12 is a very nice, very popular, especially around here. A lot of the houses that we see from the 18th, 19th, 20th century even, very comfortable. It's steep enough to have an effect on rain and snow. It's kind of balanced. You start getting to 6-12 and you're starting to get, okay, well, maybe that's a temple form. You think about Greek temples, maybe appropriate at a bigger scale, like a bank building or something. But then you get getting lower, like a 4-12, and it starts to just get kind of ugly, like army barrack or, warehouse kind of thing. So by picking that slope of a roof, you're not only responding to weather and what materials you're going to clad it with, you're responding to these cultural signifiers. It's just a loaded thing. And then flat roof, another whole ball of wax.
Yeah. Okay. Well, what's funny is you mentioned there's a lot of older houses around here, 1800s, some even in the late 1700s.
Yeah.
Though, especially in Newport.
Oh, yeah.
Have you ever had to sort of update one of those older houses?
Oh yeah.
Okay, so what's the biggest challenge when converting those houses?
I think the biggest challenge, which if done well works well, is knowing what you're looking at it and deciding what's important to keep and what you can get rid of. So I mentioned the Stonewall house that we just finished up at Brown University. That house was originally built, it was actually built over something like 8 years. I'm going to get the dates wrong here, but something like 1816 to 1824. You think about, and it was built by a pair of brothers who owned a stone cutting company. And I'll think of their name in a second. But these brothers, basically, you think about what Providence was like at the beginning of the 19th century. It was the woods. They were cutting down trees in the forest, dragging them over, milling them on site, putting them up with tools that were pretty limited, whatever they could forge or build themselves. That's why it took 8 years.
Yeah.
If you're doing the project yourself. So knowing that was its history, when we looked at the house, something was not right. There's some weird details like this almost French ironwork out front. And then you go inside, and it's like, you know what? That mantle looks like the mantle in my house from 1890, and that over there looks like, industrial mills, frame. It's old, but it's like maybe 1920. And so, sure enough, the house had a massive renovation in the early 20th century, so around 1915 to 1920. And the person who did that had very Victorian taste. So they gutted the place. And what's even more important, once we uncovered the walls, we discovered that they'd cut into the structure. So the old house, it was basically a tree trunk in each post and a pin and tenon joint. The Victorian era renovation essentially just cut those structural posts and basically weakened the whole frame. So our structure engineer was a bit horrified.
Yeah.
And so, I don't think that if we had been doing that renovation, we would have done something like that, sacrificed the structure and cut away part of that character. At the same time, the Victorian interiors was kind of nothing special. And, it wasn't really a key part of the story of the house. It was somebody's kind of decorating project. And so we made the choice because we could and the university agreed with us that we would keep as much as we could, but we weren't going to be too precious about it. But the parts of the house that were very authentic to that original building and really told the story of these stone cutters who were, crucial to Brown's campus. They were the stone cutters for the state capitol building. Was kind of what we really wanted to get back to. So,
yeah. So I guess this is a pretty generic question, but what do you think the biggest misconception about architects in your industry is?
Yeah, what drives me absolutely crazy, and this comes from people who really ought to know better. And I think it comes from maybe more lawyers and other people around and financial experts, is they think that the architects take somebody else's ideas and come in and make it look pretty. It's just like, it's got to be kidding me.
Yeah.
As you've heard me to kind of describe all the kind of thinking and strategizing and understanding, what community goals are, what the building needs to be. I like to think we do architecture for the blind in that it's still got to be a great building even if you can't see it. Aesthetics and beauty comes from a deep understanding and meshing of an understanding of those goals and constraints. And if it's beautiful, it's because it deploys that in a way that's more than the sum of its parts. So making it look pretty makes it sound incredibly trivial, and it's not at all what the goal is. Beauty, I think, is a concept in and of itself that's different from pretty, and I think most people understand it.
Yeah.
So it's when people think of design as something shallow or surface or something that gets applied after all the important decisions are made, that's kind of what drives me bananas.
Okay. And you had mentioned that you really come from an art background.
And married with the technology.
We're married with the
science.
tech, but your real passion, like you said, was art, correct? Would that be?
I think it's a balance.
Okay.
I absolutely think it's a balance. I'm
Okay.
probably on the more technical side of a lot of things, even though I do consider myself an artist. I paint,
Okay.
I draw. I really see that balance is the key to it.
So how do you incorporate your love for art and the balance with your sort of technical side too? Like, how do you incorporate that into your designs?
So I think it's all different sides of the same coin, and where it comes together is this notion of human-centered design that in the last couple of years we've been increasingly aware of that as kind of centering our discussion. And it's something I've always been fascinated by. And I guess what I will give you an example of that I've used a couple of times. When you think about how we perceive different things, and understanding of how the brain works and how people respond to their environment is pretty key. There is a part of the brain that recognizes faces, chairs, and buildings. It's like, okay, that seems like a weird group of things to put together. But when you think about that, that means that there's a certain digestibility of scale and features that are common, and we have an evolutionary response that suggests that it's to our benefit to recognize something of a certain grouping with a certain scale. And it tells us that there's something about buildings that, even though humans were around for a lot longer than we had buildings, there's something about recognition of an animal or a cave or some other element of the environment that's triggering something very deep-rooted in us. So by using science to understand, for example, what those cognitive perceptions are, you can then exploit it in an artistic way. So, for example, we have a building that we're designing that uses a gradient of bricks. And the idea is that it's using our optical kind of perception. You obviously see individual pixels, say, on a computer, right? Everybody gets the point of white, black, and then the more black you have, the darker it looks. We're using a brick pattern that blends white and brick patterns to take advantage of our human eyes' ability to blend them. So it looks like a gradient. Not every animal out there sees in the same way. But our minds are geared towards saying, okay, that gradient is going to suggest that's the same plane, and then we have a sharp edge that suggests depth. And so it's an optical illusion, but once you understand how that brain works, you can then intentionally set up things with gradients, breaks, and planes to create a visual effect that's actually pretty stunning. And it just seems like magic, but it's like, no, it comes from science, but it's an artistic effect. So that's I guess what I mean by a balance. It's you have to understand one to do the other.
Yeah, interesting. So is there any type of project that you haven't done yet that you would like to eventually do in your career?
Oh my goodness, there's so many. I don't know why I'm thinking of roller coasters, but that sounds like a really fun thing.
Well, maybe if Rocky Point comes back to Rhode Island.
Right.
Maybe.
I mean, I've had the privilege to work on so many different things, hotels and restaurants, but residences, apartment buildings, offices, labs. Honestly, I have a fascination with hotels and just the variety of environments and the notion of kind of escape, yet comfort and home, and the degree to which that kind of sensory and experience is critical to making the place. So, we've done hotels, but I'd love to do more. That seems like a great thing.
Have you done one from the ground up?
Nope,
okay.
Not from the ground up. Maybe in the future. We haven't pursued that. We've been frankly quite busy.
Yeah.
So, but it's always interesting thing.
What was the most challenging part about renovating the Dean Hotel, like you were saying earlier? Like, what was was that it was an old hotel that you had to renovate?
Well, it's kind of infamous.
Yeah.
So it was built as basically as supportive housing by the Catholic Church. I'm sorry, it was the Episcopalian Church. The Reverend Theodore Decker raised funds, and it was a haven for people who were transients, which is the old-fashioned word for people experiencing homelessness or moving through town. Also people who had issues with drugs, with drinking. And his model was that he would provide room and board, but then you would work in the soup kitchen. You would work cleaning up the place. So you would work for your stay, and then he would deliver sermons, and so kind of this Christian education was a part of it. So that lasted until the Reverend died, and then it immediately became kind of a seedy flop house. Dancing, dime dances. It became a punk rock bar for a while, and then unfortunately became kind of a strip club with rooms for rent by the hour. So very, very convenient, but the building had really decayed to the point where, and so many bad renovations that it was just a terrible building, and a lot of people looked at it and just passed because it was kind of tough. The way it was built was actually some really innovative construction techniques. In 1912, I think it was finished. It used terracotta block as fireproofing walls, which are great at stopping fires. It was very safe. It was built with shafts all over the place for ventilation to help the spread of infectious diseases, if that sounds familiar. But those kind of features made it actually really difficult to renovate. Think about trying to drill a hole to put a new wire through a terracotta block. It's going to shatter.
Yeah.
And so it's like technical challenges of doing a renovation affordably. It's not like taking down a wood framed wall. You pretty much take a hammer and you're done. But
Yeah.
Any kind of changes like that and installing new modern systems were a really big part of it. But we did very green systems, heat pumps for all the rooms, and very efficient windows and things like that. So I'm just bringing back all sorts of trauma, thinking through how difficult it was.
Something else that's interesting is I feel like a lot of people look at, like you said, architecture on the surface, right? You just design the building. But you mentioned the heat pumps, and that made me just think, like, you have to go in there and design all the systems, the layouts for the electricity, the HVAC, everything.
Well, yeah, and we do have a team of engineers and experts. It's a big team. I would say they say that for every $1 million of construction, and this number may be out of date, there's 37 jobs. And so those jobs are obviously contractors, but it's also a host of people. We have about 50 engineers, architects, designers of every stripe on a given project. So the architect is usually at the center of that team. We like to have contractors on board early as well for input with pricing and constructability. But yeah, we have to be thinking about that. Those decisions are made early. I'm full of pithy sayings, but another thing that seems to prove out is that 80% of the costs of something are in the first 20% of a project life. And it's those early stage decisions that says, look, what kind of heating system are we going to do? What kind of structural system? How big, how wide, what's the proportion of wall to the floor that really shape a lot of the later constraints that happen. So
yeah. What do you think is the biggest change in the architecture industry from when you first started to now?
I think it's a good one. I think that the awareness of energy efficiency and building science is commonplace now.
Okay.
It's like no longer a big deal. It's like, look, we have an efficient, wall. It's like, yeah. I mean, I think there's still improvements to be made. I think that, that's all really a good measure. I think there's... I think perhaps a reaction to modernism that has been bad, that has sort of given modernism a bad name, and that's changed a lot. I think people are a lot less receptive in a lot of places to more contemporary design, with the exclusion of maybe New York, Tokyo, London, and I think that's unfortunate because modern architecture is really recent phenomena, and the thing about buildings that are older is if it's an unloved building, it tends to get torn down or renovated. So all the bad stuff, most of the bad stuff anyway, is kind of gone. And what we're seeing from, the year 1850 is pretty much the best that was there because people loved it and they saved it and they put money and time and effort into keeping it. So we have this romantic vision of older architecture, but really, we're still sorting through the process of what from the mid-century and later really want to keep and what was successful at kind of responding to human needs. There are plenty of buildings I could show you that are very modern, very contemporary, that still provide a richness of experience, great lighting, wonderful warmth and pattern, great environments to meet people and work from. So, I think that's another challenge, I think, is getting people to be open-minded about what architecture really means beyond that surface level symbolism.
Yeah. Something I found insanely interesting is, so I recently got my real estate license, and I want to say like the second weekend after I got my license, I went to a bunch of open houses in Newport. Yeah. And just because I wanted to go meet realtors and go honestly see some of the houses for sale. So I set in a minimum for like $1 million. I wanted to be able to go in and see these houses.
Oh, yeah.
And one of the houses that came up is 104 Mill Street. I met the realtor. I think his name was Giovanni. Super nice guy. Yeah. And seemed like a really good realtor. The house was listed for like $4 million, but it was this really old, like we're talking late 1700s. It's the oldest brick house in Newport.
Wow.
And you walked into that house So there was an addition that you walk in at first, but you take a left, and you just feel like a presence, like of the history of how many people have been in that house, probably. And you go up the stairs, and it's creaking, and it's creaking.
Where it's dented, where steps have gone on it.
And then you go up, and there's like, when you walk in a modern house in like the second story, you can't feel that there's a story underneath you when you're in those houses. And it's creaking in the floor, and you can sometimes like see between the floorboards in some places where they haven't put in insulation or anything like that. But like, it's just crazy, like when you feel a presence like that, like the historic presence.
Reminds you of gravity, right? I mean, you have new appreciation of structure, and that's one of those sensory and those cognitive things that I think is really interesting. One of my favorite books, most influential, I think, is Welcome to Your World by Sarah Goldhagen. We actually brought her up to Providence before the pandemic to give a lecture, standing crowd only, really lays out a very compelling and concise set of data on how to tie that research around human cognition. And one of her points was about your bodily, your sense of body, right? If you think about being a kid on the swing sets, that's actually a really valuable learning experience to understand where you are in relation to space and how you relate to objects, what gravity means. And so when you're talking about being on that second floor, that's a little jumpy, it stimulates that sense of our physical being that's so different from the digital world. And that's a place where people talk about virtual reality and augmented reality. I've heard of restaurants that all they do is show projections on the wall in a black box, but there's no real substitute unless you're at a Disney ride for that kind of physicality of the architecture. So, and that bounce in the floor is pretty much building codes. I mean, it's not terribly safe.
And then like the fireplaces on the second floor, like you don't see that anymore.
No, you
ever.
really don't.
And it's just super, like you walk in there and you can see like the fireplace, like how black the bricks are from all the different fires. And like, I don't know, like it was just fascinating to walk in there, and you're like, and like how weird the layout is, because all the rooms are really small, but you're in this massive house.
Well, no, and I mean, and it's great because it begs all these questions of, well, how did they live? Why are the rooms small? Why is there a fireplace? Oh, because it's really cold. And you weren't going to spend all your wood heating up some giant space if you didn't have to. Like, heat one space and bundle up, sit by the fire. Whatever that is, so again, it comes back to that expectations of comfort and equality. Like, we may complain about, how sterile some of these systems are, but, you put somebody in the woods for a weekend without a working toilet, and pretty full of complaints.
Well, I've had an absolutely amazing conversation with you. Thank you very much. It's been a blast.
Absolutely. I could talk all night.
And I end every podcast with this one question.
Okay.
This question is, if you could leave one piece of advice for the listener, it could be about business, architecture, life, anything you want it to be, what sort of advice would you leave?
I think there's a lot of talk. I will give the general kind of life advice, because there's a lot of young people really doing some soul searching right now, or kind of trying to figure their way. There's a lot of adults, who are really reevaluating their lives, their careers. The pandemic has been this big snow globe where it just, what can we count on, and where do we want to be? The best advice I ever got in turn, I want to credit my friend Michelle Wilcox, who's actually president of Crossroads, said to me, forget about pursuing your passions. I mean, that's great. That'll keep you interested, but that's a little bit selfish. And if everybody followed their passions, like, the entire world would just be musicians. Like, seriously, everybody would just.
Who doesn't like a good song?
Exactly. Everybody wants to go play drums in a rock band. It's like, or most people. So following your passions isn't really going to lead to a sense of deep fulfillment. You may find that that's a pretty short path. Instead, follow meaning. Find meaning in something, because as she explained it, does she love like going to clean up the stoop where somebody may have vomited the night before? It's like, no, nobody does, right?
Yeah.
But that's keeping the city clean. You know that you're taking care of somebody who needs your help right then. If you can find meaning in that and helping others, for example, or you may find meaning in art and kind of sharing your vision, sharing your emotional experience of a place, or maybe you're working on a a spaceship, right? You're an engineer and you're developing a new kind of part that's going to help keep that engine from exploding, and we can test the limits of human knowledge. If you can find meaning in a job that also is something that you want to do and then people will pay you for, like that's the golden life right there. So
Absolutely. Well, that's great advice. Thank you very much for sharing that. And yeah, like I said, been a blast talking to you. Thank you very much for taking time out of your day to come on the podcast.
Yeah, super fun. Thanks.
Absolutely.
Glad to
And
be here.
yeah, thank you all for listening to the Knowledge is Power podcast. And if you want to get these episodes weeks in advance, you can subscribe to Knowledge is Power on Patreon. This episode, I think, will be posted the first week of February, but it'll be available on Patreon probably this weekend.
Great.
So for all of you listening, go subscribe on Patreon and support the podcast. Also, don't forget to follow Knowledge is Power on Instagram. So thank you all for listening, and I will catch you in the next one.